So what we're discussing today, we're going to look at food waste, where it happens, some of the statistics around food waste and how that impacts our environment, our food security, and overall our health. I'll share a few of the organizations that I've come across that are doing really positive work to address the food waste issue globally, nationally, and locally. And then finally, since food waste is something that we make a decision on every single day, multiple times a day, it's really something that with simple strategies and more knowledge, we can try to make more informed choices on a daily basis. So things that you can maybe implement in your own life as well as share with your patients and clients. But before I dive into that, I have a great video that I love to share anytime I'm talking about food waste. And this video is called The Extraordinary Life and Times of Strawberry. For those who came to the FMAND event, you already saw this, but I think it just does a wonderful job really bringing home the point of how personal this issue is and how we can make so many decisions that are completely mindless to us, but not really see how impactful and meaningful those decisions are. But what I really love about that is that I think it's so often as consumers that we forget everything that goes into our food. We forget all the miles, all the energy, all the hands, all the love, the people that took time and energy to grow that, the people at the grocery store that put it on the shelves, the energy, the gas that was used in our car to drive it from A to B to C to D. And if we just throw that food away, what is the point of all that? So it's really challenging us to critically think a little bit more about our food, which we as dietitians do all the time. So to get us started, let's talk just a little bit about some definitions that are kind of helpful on food waste. So food waste gets thrown around a lot, but by definition, it is food that is lost, discarded, or uneaten. And when we're talking about food waste, it happens differently in different places in the world. So here in the United States, we would be considered a developed country with a very well-developed food system. We have amazing equipment that harvests our crops on time, and a transportation system that allows that food to move from A to B to C to D very efficiently. We have a very stable political system. We don't have war and things that are breaking out in our country that are disrupting our food supply. So the majority of waste that happens in our country is not really in those early stages of the food supply. It's happening later. The majority happens what we consider to be at the consumer level, the decisions that are made at grocery stores and restaurants, and then what we're doing directly in our homes. On the opposite side, what happens often in developed countries is more in those early stages of production. There might be issues with harvesting the crop in a timely manner. There might be inadequate storage facilities that have the humidity too high and the entire crop rots. There might be instability with transportation and not being able to move crops as initially planned, so things end up sitting somewhere longer than intended, and that results in the crop going to waste. So kind of an interesting way to look at it, that it happens differently in different parts of the world. But for the majority of what I'll be talking about today, we're really going to focus on where waste is happening in the United States, because that's where most of us as dietitians are working, where we live, and really how we can make impact with ourselves as well as the people you're working with. So I just wanted to briefly kind of touch into those different areas again a little bit more. Those early stages of the food supply chain, production, harvest, and transportation. If you grew up on a farm, you know that there's pests, insects, diseases, hailstorms, flooding, all sorts of things that can happen that are somewhat considered to be outside of our control. There's a lot of work that happens on the agricultural side with plant production, plant breeding, that is trying to make our crops more resilient to those things, but a lot of that is in the hands of Mother Nature. Moving down, the next level is where we talk about processing and packaging. So this is where our mostly our fruits and vegetables are trimmed up in different ways that might make it more interesting or easily accessible to our consumers. So our packaged broccolis and cauliflowers, where a lot of those trimmings have been taken off. And this is also where a process called culling happens. I'll talk a little bit more about this, but this is where some of those cosmetically imperfect foods get pulled out of making their way directly to a grocery store. They might be used for something like a canned product or a processed food, or they might not be able to be used at all because they are determined to be too ugly. And there's been a lot of work on the food waste conversation to try to get people to rethink what is a food's acceptability is by the way it looks. And that was how my organization got founded, was trying to teach people about ugly food and not judging those three-legged carrots and misshapen cucumbers. They're still good and perfectly acceptable to eat. The next is the retail and food service level. So that is our grocery stores. That is a whole lot of waste happens in the grocery store. There's a lot of work happening in grocery stores to try to reduce that. But when we talk about consumer expectations, when we walk into the produce section, we expect to see heaping bins of fruits and vegetables. And that abundance prompts us to buy more. If you go into the section for apples and there's only 2 apples in there, our consumer psychology will make us believe that there's something wrong with those apples and we shouldn't buy them because no one else picked them, so I'm not going to buy them. When in all actuality, they might be perfectly fine, but if there's a big bin of apples, it gets us more prompted to buy more. And grocery stores know that, so that is how they stock their shelves and leads to some waste. There's a lot of confusion over the dating system, which I'll also talk a little bit more about in my tips. But that leads to waste with people not buying and stores not carrying food when it goes past those dates. And then finally, the consumer level. And those are the decisions, like I said, that eaters are making in their homes, at restaurants, and any other place that we eat, which seems like almost everywhere today, right? But that is, again, the dating system gets really confusing. Overbuying, that video with the strawberries, you might have a kid there that gives you a little tug, Mom, I want strawberries. Oh, my daughter wants to eat a fruit, of course I'll buy her that. And then if there's no plan to eat it, you eat one and then the whole thing goes to waste. So really trying to be intentional and be thoughtful about the foods that we're buying and how we're going to eat them. And then I'll also give my little shtick about leftovers, but I'm a big leftover advocate, so hopefully I can turn you all into leftover lovers, which I know as dietitians you all are already, but maybe giving you some tips to talk to your friends, your family, be super annoying at Christmas with everybody. All right, so you already saw this stat, 40% of food resources in the United States go to waste each year. This number came out in a report from the Natural Resource Defense Council in 2012, and that report is really what kind of opened the lid on this conversation about food waste. So my presentation today is in a long line of work that has been done around food waste. Who here has been hearing a lot about food waste? It is a very hot conversation right now. And that report that came out from the Natural Resource Defense Council, and that number, 40%, is what really put people into that shock and saying, oh my gosh, this is terrible, this is not okay, we need to do something. And so it's one thing to talk about that number, but it's another thing to talk about what the impact of that number means. When we're throwing away 40% of our food resources in the United States, how is that impacting us? How is that impacting the health of our economy? How is that impacting the health of our population? So one of the first things I always like to talk about is the economic issue. For some reason, when we throw away food, we don't feel like we're throwing away money. If you spend $4 on that container of strawberries, when you throw that container of strawberries, it doesn't make the same connection that you're throwing $4 in the trash. There is a disconnect there. And on average, in the United States, we throw away somewhere between $165 to $180 billion worth of food every year. The average family of 4 throws away somewhere between $190 and $200 of food away a month. And in the United States, we spend $750 million in our waste and sanitation services just to throw away the food, dispose of the food that we don't eat. So we go into all this work of growing, preparing, processing, packaging, getting into the grocery store, having people buy it, bring it home, they throw it away. And then as a country, we spend $750 million to throw that, or to get rid of that. So a pretty bad situation. I'm guessing most are pretty aware of the unfortunate food insecurity issues that we have in this country. With 1 in 6 Americans being food insecure and 1 in 5 children, these are Feeding America statistics, thinking about throwing away all of that food and not getting into the hands of people who need it That's a pretty unfortunate paradox that we're living in. We're wasting this much, but then we have these folks in need. And of course, it's not that simple to simply say, we just need to get the food that we're wasting into the hands of the people who need it. There are a whole number of issues with regards to purchasing power, transportation, jobs, housing, all of the things that impact our folks who are experiencing food insecurity. But something that really kind of tugs at your heartstrings when you think about throwing away food and knowing that there are people who don't need it. And of course, food insecurity might draw people to make less healthful food choices, maybe buying some of those highly processed, highly packaged, cheaper food options. And so that's what kind of gets me thinking about with the foods that we're throwing away, a big bulk of that is fruits and vegetables. Those really nutrient-dense foods that we would like to see more all people eating, but definitely making those foods available to our food insecure populations too, so that they're able to have access to those awesome foods. And then last, but certainly not least, is the environmental impact. So there are a number of things that go into this environmental bubble when we talk about food waste. The first is that wasting of natural resources. So did anyone here grow up on a farm or have an agricultural background? Okay, quite a few. So we know that there is a huge amount of natural resources that go into the production of food. There is land, there is water, there are all the fuel costs that go into running that equipment. And in the US, our getting food from farm to fork, it uses 10% of our US energy budget, 50% of the land in the US, and 80% of all fresh water consumed goes into food production. And so thinking about that, throwing 40% of it, that is a really poor use of our natural resources. In addition, when we toss food in the trash and that goes into our landfills, rotting food emits a greenhouse gas called methane. Methane is 25 times more potent than CO2. So when that gas, when that food is breaking down in the landfill and that greenhouse gas is getting emitted, that is a much stronger change to our environment and impact on the greenhouse than what might be the CO2 that is coming out of our cars. So really thinking about how that food is impacted in the landfill. And then I mentioned again the wasted water, and water is just continuing to become a more serious conversation in our global, in the health of our environmental health on a global scale. Water scarcity issues, drought issues in certain parts of the world. So really needing to be thoughtful about how we're using water, and then making sure that how we're using it is not used to make something that we ultimately throw away. All right, so gloom and doom, it's all bad, wasting food is terrible, it does terrible things to our environment. So let's talk quickly about some really good things that are happening with organizations and movements that are trying to address this issue. The first is one of my favorite global nonprofits called Feedback. They have been around since 2009, so they've been working on this issue for over 10 years, and they're working on a global scale to address the food waste issue. And they do this through three main platforms. One is called Feeding the 5,000. This is really a public demonstration event where they go into cities across the world and they pop in and they work to rescue all sorts of food that would go to waste. So if there's a farm that might have unharvested crops, if there's a bakery with day-old bread, if there's things that are going to get thrown away at the grocery store, if there's leftovers at a restaurant, rescue as much as they can, and then they make a massive meal in the center of the community to feed 5,000 people. And it's a really powerful way to show people in a small area how much of their food is going to waste on a regular basis. And it's really something to draw in that media, social element to all of this to get people to think more critically on it. In the US, there's been one in New York City and one in Washington, DC. The one in Washington, DC was in DuPont Circle, and they had this massive vat of paella in the middle of the circle where people were getting food and eating out of, and just kind of a fascinating, sad but fascinating way to show that. The second is the pig idea, feeding food waste to pigs. Seems like a no-nonsense, common sense approach to solving this issue. There were some concerns at one point about feeding food waste to pigs. It might not be kosher to feed bacon to a pig, you know. But they, thank you. But they've done some work in terms of how our food waste is then processed or heated to make sure that there's no issues with that. So really trying to change that conversation around getting that wasted food, because pigs will eat anything. And then the last is a gleaning network, which they have piloted on or promoted on a global scale, but hopefully you all have heard that we have a gleaning network in North Dakota. This launched 2 years ago, called Glean ND. And for those who are not familiar with gleaning is an ancient practice where people would go out into fields after a farmer had already harvested his crop. This was kind of before the time of machine harvesting. This was hand harvesting. And if there was anything left in the field, then they would harvest that. And that was really a peasant practice. It was done out of necessity and hunger and a lack of ability to buy food. Today, this practice is re-emerging because there are multiple situations where a farmer may not be able to harvest all of his or her food. Maybe they lack the labor, maybe they lack the time, maybe the field is too wet and they're not going to go out there with their machine, but if a group of people are willing to walk and harvest the food, they are able to do so. So in North Dakota, a gleaning network launched in 2018 to go out to farms in the region, harvest that extra food, and bring it into our local food bank, or if it was a smaller amount, into the local food pantries. In the pilot season alone, they rescued over 7,000 pounds of food, and this is something that they are always looking for volunteers and also wanting to connect with farmers or gardeners that have extra food too. So check out gleannd.org, and I would encourage you all to sign up, or maybe it'd be a fun outing for the Fargo-Moorhead Dietetics group to get together and do this summer, to get out on a farm and harvest some food. All right, so I'm going to quickly fly through these things because I only have 10 minutes, and 10 minutes goes really fast. So one thing that I think is the most empowering part about the food waste conversation is that it is a global issue. We are talking about hunger, we are talking about the environment, we are talking about economics. It's a major player in all of those issues, but it is something that every single person can make a choice on and make a difference on. And it can be the choices you make as individuals, the choices that you help to promote within your families, encouraging your friend networks, and then also taking into your practice and talking about with patients and clients. So I'm going to quickly go through 7 tips that I have that I found to be really helpful when talking about addressing food waste. And the first, dietitians, is portion size. The plates that we have, I'm sure most are aware, at the common dinner plate is 10 to 11 inches. On average, people tend to overportion themselves about 25%. So on average, a person will dish themselves, like with the plates that we had at lunch today. You'll fill the plate full because you have the full plate, you've got to fill it all up, and then you'll leave about 25% of it. Is anyone thinking about their lunch today and like, yeah, I left about 25%? So smaller plate. You'll still fill it full, but you won't fill it with as much food. Therefore, wasting less. And we all know that we tend to eat with our eyes versus eating with our stomachs sometimes. So seeing that full plate, it gives us the feeling of fullness and satisfaction. This is a super common weight loss recommendation too, so it's kind of nice to know that these two things can be paralleled when you're talking with folks, that I'm telling you this because you might be interested in weight loss, but hey, it's also going to hopefully let you waste less food too. So number 1, portion size. Number 2 is being a planner and being proud of it. Anyone here militant, grocery store, planning, list, stick to the list? Yeah, this is definitely more than the usual crowd I'm speaking to. Dietitians are planners for sure. But this makes a huge difference in terms of looking at your schedule, inventorying what you already have, making a list, having a plan for how you're going to use that food. One of the most surefire ways to make sure you waste food is having no plan for how you're going to eat it. So really thinking about that grocery list and that meal list. For some people, when I'm talking to them and I say this and they're like, there is no way I'm ever gonna do that. I do not have time, I do not have energy. The main thing that I tell people with that is just take a picture of what's inside your refrigerator before you go to the grocery store. If you don't have time to do the full inventory, then at least when you're going through the produce section or the dairy section, you can at least take a look at on your phone and say, oh, I do have 2 cartons of milk. Okay, I don't need to buy more milk. oh, okay, there is already spinach in there. Because the things that are in our refrigerator, those are the perishable things that are going to waste. Our freezer, it's got a really good shelf life, or freezer life. Our pantry items have a really good shelf life. That refrigerator is where the waste is happening. So at the very least, just take a picture of your refrigerator. The next is the dating system. Who here feels like they are an expert on the food dating system? You know it. Eggs, oh yeah, that's 4 weeks past the sell-by date. Yeah, I don't see it. Oh, I got one. All right. So it's super confusing. There are over 50 different ways in which food is dated in our country, which just makes people confused. And oftentimes, people have no idea what they mean. Best by, best if used by, sell by. So they see the date and they throw it away. And so what I try to tell folks is that the only food that is required by the federal government to carry a date is infant formula. Other than that, it is a manufacturer's best guess of when the food will still be at the highest quality. And I know that dietitians know a lot about food safety, but the average consumer does not know a lot about food safety. And just because a food has gotten old does not mean it's going to make you sick. Foodborne sickness from eating food is an issue of cross-contamination, not old food. Sour milk tastes terrible, but it's not going to make you sick. You can still use sour milk in pancakes. So I think we need to try to get people to rethink what actually is an issue of food safety and what is an issue of food quality. And a lot of those processed foods that carry that date, those are really quality issues. Like ranch dressing, you can't tell me that what's all in ranch, it's only good for 6 months. That stuff will last a long time. This one is from the Environmental Protection Agency, and they say, based on their research, this is one of the most effective things you can do. Make an eat me first shelf and put it in your refrigerator. Leftovers go there. Produce that's about to go bad go there. Your dairy products that need to get used in a short amount of time. This is especially helpful for larger families that have a large number of people going in and out and grabbing food at different times. Then whomever the head of the household is, I'm guessing it's the mom, but whoever is responsible for that refrigerator, then you know that everything that's on there, encourage your family to grab from there first. This stuff is ready to go, eat this, let's get this moving out. And then you don't have to feel bad when you find that container of strawberries tucked in the way back corner of your fridge that you totally forgot about. Keep everything on that eat me first shelf. Be a leftover warrior. So many people do not take home their leftovers. Or when you're out eating, let's say you're at an Italian restaurant, you're having pasta, you might pick through and pick out the veggies and the chicken, eat some of the noodles, and then the rest of the noodles go to waste. They might be the bread basket there. You have one piece and the rest of the bread basket goes to waste. You're eating at a Mexican restaurant and there's a little bit of rice and a little bit of beans, the tortilla chips are sitting at the table, you let that all go to waste. What I really want to try to encourage people to do is really think about all of that food. I know that it doesn't make a complete meal. I know that it doesn't maybe look that glamorous when you're taking it home. It's not like the steak. Of course people take home their steaks. That's something that people are like, of course I do. But it's all those little bits of food that we don't really think about and we just let that go to waste. It all adds up. And really being thoughtful about our leftovers. And the other thing I will say too is not being so discriminate about when you eat your leftovers. So sometimes if you've had Mexican food the night before, think about maybe having that and incorporating it into a breakfast. Those fajitas from the night before with some eggs and a tortilla shell could make a great breakfast burrito. So really thinking about playing around with those leftovers and being a champion for that. Culinary skills make a huge difference. The more talented we are in the kitchen, the more we know how to use knife skills, the more we know how to use all different foods, spices, all of those things will really help us. This is also a great thing when we're talking about the ugly food too, which is my last tip for you all. So I told you that my organization started with a mission to bring awareness to the issue of ugly food. That is those crooked cucumbers, those misshapen carrots, the really gnarly looking tomatoes. Consumers have an expectation that those things might not be something that they want to eat, but they are in fact really great, nutritious, healthy food. This is a picture from the Red River Market with one of our vendors who grows amazing tomatoes. But really thinking about why we determine a food to be good or not good, and that cosmetics really doesn't have a big part of that. Those perfectly round red tomatoes versus some of these misshapen, multicolored, still a little dirt on them straight from the garden tomatoes actually have way better flavor in these, probably a higher nutritional value too. So give some love to those ugly foods, and with the right culinary skills, they can be incorporated into all sorts of wonderful things. I am out of time, but thank you all so much. This was super fun, and I'll be around for a while to answer any questions.